Hello. Ladies and gentlemen, do you think a private investigator, a man who makes a living catching cheaters, could miss his own wife sneaking around right under his nose? Sounds unlikely, right? After all, I have a trained eye, an instinct for deception, a nose for lies. But I did miss it. Completely. And the worst part? I discovered it entirely by accident, while working a routine case. Just another day, another job, another unfaithful spouse to expose. Only, I wasn't prepared for what I found. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Let's go back to the day it all started. I had just finished my second cup of coffee when the call came in. It was early spring in Chicago, the kind of damp morning where the skyline looked hazy over the lake. The office was quiet, save for the faint hum of my desktop computer and the occasional creak of the old wooden floors. John Mercer, Private Investigations, I answered, leaning back in my chair. The voice on the other end was male, strained, hesitant. Mr. Mercer, I need your help. I think my wife is seeing someone. It was always the same opening, the same suspicion, the same uncertainty. After 10 years in this business, I could already predict the rest of the conversation. The storylines varied, but the theme remained unchanged: doubt, followed by proof, followed by heartbreak. All right, I said, grabbing my notepad. Why don't you start from the beginning? The man introduced himself as Mark Ellison, a financial consultant based in Oak Park. He and his wife, Vanessa, had been married for 9 years, lived in a well-kept Tudor on Ridgeland Avenue, and had 2 kids, both in elementary school. She's been acting different lately, he admitted. Coming home late, dressing up more than usual, laughing at her phone. I've asked her about it, and she just says I'm being paranoid. I let him talk. The best way to get a read on a client was to listen, not just to what they said, but how they said it. His voice wavered, but there was something else underneath: anger. He wanted the truth, yes, but more than that, he wanted proof. I jotted down the details. She worked as a project manager at an architecture firm in the West Loop, left for work at 7:30 a.m., and usually got home around 6, except lately, she'd been returning closer to 10. You have any names in mind? I asked. A pause. Then, hesitantly, I think it might be someone from her office. She keeps mentioning a guy named Andrew. A name. That made things easier. We scheduled a meeting for later that afternoon at a coffee shop near his office. I hung up and exhaled slowly, rubbing my temples. I knew how this would play out. I'd follow Vanessa for a few days, snap some pictures, confirm the worst, and then hand over the evidence. It was just another case. Routine. By 4 o'clock, I was sitting across from Mark at a quiet corner table in a cafe off Lake Street. He was in his late 30s, clean-shaven, with the tired eyes of a man who had spent too many nights staring at the ceiling. He pushed a manila folder across the table. These are some of her recent schedules, he said, and some pictures of her co-workers from a company retreat. I circled Andrew. I flipped through the photos. Vanessa was easy to spot. Long brown hair, sharp features, a natural confidence in her posture. And there he was, standing beside her in several shots. Early 40s, fit, wearing designer suits that were a little too well-tailored. I'd seen enough of these cases to know the look. I'll start surveillance tomorrow, I said, slipping the folder into my bag. I'll need access to any credit card records you have, just to track her spending patterns. And if you can get her work schedule, even better. Mark nodded, then hesitated. And if you find something? I met his eyes. Then you'll know. That was all there was to say. The next morning, I was parked half a block from Vanessa's house in my black Chevy Impala, sipping gas station coffee and watching the front door through my side mirror. It was a crisp day, the sun cutting sharp angles through the city streets. At exactly 7:30, Vanessa stepped outside, dressed in a fitted navy dress and heels. She got into her white Lexus RX, pulled out of the driveway, and headed downtown. I gave her a minute before easing onto the road behind her. I tailed her down I-290, weaving through the usual morning congestion. She exited onto West Randolph and pulled into a parking garage near her office. I parked down the block and waited. Surveillance was a waiting game. You spent hours sitting in your car, eating vending machine snacks, and staring at the same door until something happened. Sometimes, Nothing did. Other times, everything unraveled in a matter of seconds. By lunchtime, Vanessa emerged from the building, her phone pressed to her ear. She wasn't heading to a cafe or meeting up with colleagues. Instead, she walked briskly down the block and got into a black BMW waiting at the curb. Andrew. I grabbed my camera and started snapping. They drove to a quiet bistro in Lincoln Park, tucked into a corner booth, and leaned in close as they spoke. Nothing explicit, just subtle touches, lingering eye contact, the kind of body language that suggested something beneath the surface. By the time they left, I had what I needed. The case was unfolding exactly as expected. Routine. Methodical. But I had no idea that in a few days, I'd be looking through this very same lens, watching something that would tear my entire life apart. The cold Chicago air bit at my face as I crouched on the roof of a brick townhouse in the heart of Oak Park, my camera lens trained on the second-floor window. It was just after 9 p.m., and from my vantage point, I had a clear view into the dimly lit bedroom where Vanessa Ellison, my client's wife, was meeting her mystery man. The BMW I had followed earlier was parked neatly in the driveway. I had suspected it belonged to Andrew, the man Mark had feared she was involved with, and I was about to confirm it. The townhouse itself was an older but well-maintained property, with ivy creeping up the sides and a small courtyard below. Across the street, a row of similar homes stood silent, their occupants settled in for the night, unaware of the betrayal unfolding behind these walls. I exhaled slowly, adjusting my grip on my Abactivist Z71 camera, a top-of-the-line model equipped with night vision and a zoom lens capable of capturing a crisp image from 300 feet away. Years in the field had made me efficient. I knew the exact angles, the ideal lighting adjustments, the way to steady my breath so that each frame was razor-sharp. This was routine. This was the job. Inside the room, the curtains were parted just enough to give me a perfect sight line. Vanessa stood near the bed, her movements slow and deliberate as she leaned in toward Andrew. He was seated, his shirt unbuttoned, his expression confident. The scene played out like so many I had captured before. Touches that lingered too long, whispers exchanged in the quiet of a dim-lit bedroom. I lifted the camera, focusing in. The shutter clicked softly. Then the door opened. I expected maybe a late arrival, perhaps Vanessa's excuse for staying out late, another coworker stopping by to discuss business. Instead, I saw a third figure step into the room, and then my stomach dropped. I knew that face. The breath left my lungs as my wife, Emily Mercer, walked into the frame. For a moment, my brain refused to process what I was seeing. The camera in my hands remained steady, but everything else in my body felt like it had been hit by a freight train. She wasn't supposed to be here. Emily was supposed to be at a late-night yoga class downtown, something she had been attending every Thursday for the past few months. She was supposed to be driving home around this time, texting me about how tired she was, asking if I wanted her to bring anything from the 7-Eleven on Belmont. Not here. Not this. But there was no mistaking it. My wife was in that room, and she wasn't an outsider. She wasn't just arriving late, accidentally interrupting something. She was part of it. My pulse pounded in my ears as I watched the scene unfold. She greeted them like she had done this a dozen times before, slipping into the intimate space with a familiarity that made me sick. My hands trembled, but my training took over. The camera continued clicking, snapping frame after frame, capturing the moments as they happened in raw, undeniable detail. The angle, the lighting, the expressions, everything was crystal clear. I told myself to move, to stop watching, to do anything other than sit there, frozen in the night air, witnessing my wife in a world I had never imagined she belonged to. But I couldn't. The betrayal seeped into my bones. I had spent years uncovering these kinds of secrets for other people. I had watched husbands and wives destroy their marriages in the dark corners of hotel rooms, in the back seats of luxury sedans, in hidden apartments that smelled of expensive perfume and regret. But not once, not in my entire career, had I considered that my own wife was capable of this. Not once had I suspected her. The camera kept rolling, the lens documenting every interaction, every touch, every stolen glance. It was like a nightmare unfolding in real time, a slow, methodical destruction of everything I had built. She laughed, laughed, and it cut through me like glass. I had heard that laugh 1,000 times. Over coffee in the mornings. In bed late at night when we talked about nothing and everything. At family gatherings when she charmed my parents into believing we had the perfect marriage. That laugh wasn't supposed to be here. It wasn't supposed to sound like that. I swallowed the bile rising in my throat, forcing myself to stay silent. If I made a noise, if I let emotion take over, I would blow my cover. And I wasn't ready for that. Not yet. Instead, I did what I always did. I documented. I took pictures. I zoomed in. I recorded every detail. I forced myself to become an outsider in my own life, to do what I would have done for any other client. But I wasn't a client. I was the fool who had missed every sign. The one who had been chasing ghosts in other people's marriages while his own wife was right here, hiding in plain sight. My fingers were numb from gripping the camera too tightly. My body was locked in place, crouched on a rooftop in Oak Park, staring through a window into a world I should have seen coming. And yet, I hadn't. I had let myself believe she was different. That we were different. That was the real betrayal. Not just what she was doing, but the fact that she had convinced me, so completely, that she never could. A siren wailed in the distance, a reminder that the city moved on, uncaring. I lowered the camera. I had enough. My mind was already shifting gears, the way it always did when a case reached its conclusion. The evidence was gathered. The truth was out. Now, it was just a matter of what I was going to do about it. I drove through Chicago that night without knowing where I was going. The streets blurred past in streaks of neon and streetlights, the distant hum of traffic a background noise to the storm raging in my head. My hands gripped the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. Emily, my wife, my partner of 10 years. The woman who had kissed me goodbye that morning with the same lips I had just seen whispering to another man. The betrayal wasn't just in what she had done. It was in how well she had hidden it. I had been a fool, and fools get played. By the time I pulled into my office parking lot on Wabash Avenue, I had already made my decision. Emily wasn't just cheating. She was leading a second life. And if I could dig into the affairs of other people's spouses, I could damn well do the same to my own. I wasn't going to ask her for answers. I was going to find them myself. The first place I started was her phone records. Emily and I shared a family plan. She never had any reason to hide her calls or texts. I was always the one whose privacy mattered, given the nature of my work. Pulling up the data, I scanned through the most frequently dialed numbers. Most were routine. Her office, her sister, our mortgage company. But one number stood out. A 312 area code, unregistered, appearing at least 4 times a day for the past 3 months. I ran it through my database. No name, no official records. A burner phone. That was my first red flag. My second came when I checked her GPS history. Emily worked downtown near Millennium Park at a high-end marketing firm. She told me she usually grabbed lunch at the cafe next to her building, sometimes went to the gym on Michigan Avenue before heading home. But her GPS logs told a different story. Several times a week, she made a detour before coming home. A private condo in Lincoln Park. Not an office. Not a gym. A residential address. Someone lived there. Someone she visited often. My jaw clenched as I scribbled the address down. I knew what I had to do next. The next day, I took a sick day from my cases. My only case now was her. At 5:45 p.m., I parked 2 blocks away from the Lincoln Park condo and waited. The building was a sleek, modern high-rise, the kind with expensive glass balconies and a 24-hour concierge. At exactly 6:08 p.m., Emily's white Audi Q5 pulled up to the valet. I watched through my binoculars as she stepped out, dressed sharply in a fitted blazer and pencil skirt. She looked polished, confident, just like the woman I thought I knew. Except this wasn't my Emily. She walked inside without hesitation. She belonged there. I snapped pictures. The doorman held the door open for her. He knew her. More pictures. She didn't even check her phone. She knew exactly where she was going. Another picture. And then she was gone, swallowed by the lobby of a life I knew nothing about. I waited. 30 minutes. 45. An hour. At 8:23 p.m., she emerged. Her hair was slightly tousled, her blazer unbuttoned, Her movements relaxed in a way that made my stomach turn. She looked satisfied. I captured every frame as she got into her car and drove home, back to me, to our house, as if nothing had happened. The Lincoln Park condo belonged to a man named Daniel Kovacs. I found his name through a property search that night, cross-referencing it with his financials. He was a corporate lawyer, specializing in private wealth management. No wife, no kids, no record of a girlfriend. He was wealthy, discreet, the perfect candidate for someone like Emily. But something didn't add up. If Emily was just cheating with Daniel, why the burner phone? Why the frequent late-night disappearances on weekends? I kept digging, and that's when I found the club. Daniel Kovacs was a member of an underground social club in Chicago. Not the kind of club with drinks and jazz music. This was exclusive, private, invitation only. The kind of place where discretion was mandatory. I pulled phone records, membership logs, even security footage from a contact I had in private security. It took me 3 days to piece together the full picture. Emily had been attending these gatherings for over a year. Once or twice a month, she wasn't out with friends or stuck at work late. She was here, at private events, with Daniel, with others. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the pile of evidence in front of me. My chest felt tight, my pulse slow and steady like a countdown to something I didn't want to face. It wasn't just one affair. It wasn't just one man. Emily had an entire life I never knew about. I needed proof, more than what I had. So I did something I never thought I would do. I followed her inside. Dressed in a black suit, I walked into the Van Astor Club on West Kinsey, a discreet high-end venue disguised as an elite lounge. I had paid for a one-night membership using a fake name, gaining access under the pretense of being a new patron. Inside, the lighting was dim, the air thick with the scent of expensive cologne and aged whiskey. People spoke in hushed voices, disappearing into private booths and hidden corridors. I moved through the room like a ghost, scanning the crowd until I saw her. Emily stood by the bar, a cocktail in hand, laughing at something Daniel whispered into her ear. But it wasn't Daniel's presence that froze me in place. It was how natural she looked. She wasn't sneaking around, wasn't nervous, wasn't out of place. She was comfortable. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't a lapse in judgment. This was who she was. The woman who had kissed me goodbye that morning wasn't real. The real Emily was here. And as I stepped back into the shadows, I realized something chilling. I had spent my career uncovering lies, but I had never once stopped to question my own reality. Until now, the air inside my office was thick with the scent of stale coffee and exhaustion. Papers were scattered across my desk, my laptop humming quietly as I flipped through folders filled with photographs, timestamps, and surveillance logs. This was no longer an investigation. It was an autopsy. The autopsy of my marriage. For the past week, I had dedicated every waking moment to building an airtight case. Not for a client. Not for some desperate husband or wife hoping to confirm their worst fears. This time, I was both the detective and the victim. Emily wasn't just cheating. She had built a second life, one with rules, routines, and people I had never met. And now, I was going to dismantle it piece by piece. I started by creating a detailed timeline. Every night Emily had worked late. Every weekend trip to visit friends. Every event she had attended at the Van Astor Club and other private locations. I gathered transaction records, cross-referencing them with location data. Emily was meticulous. She always paid in cash at the club, avoiding a direct paper trail. But small mistakes left breadcrumbs. A valet charge on her credit card, a rideshare drop-off location near Kovacs' condo, a purchase at an exclusive lingerie boutique in River North that she never wore around me. I compiled everything into folders, sorted by date, location, and individuals involved. March 15th, Lincoln Park condo, Daniel Kovacs, 6:08 p.m. to 8:23 p.m. March 28th, Van Astor Club, 9:45 p.m. to 2:15 a.m. April 2nd, private event, West Monroe, 10:30 p.m. to 3:30 a.m. Each entry had corresponding photographs and video footage. Each entry made my chest tighten. Surveillance had always been my specialty, and this time, I treated my wife like any other target. I set up a remote camera in her Audi's dashboard, discreetly hidden near the center console. It activated whenever the engine started, automatically uploading GPS routes and recordings to a cloud server. Then, I placed a motion-activated camera in our home office. Emily rarely used it, except for personal calls. Over the past 2 weeks, she had locked the door twice while I was in the shower. I needed to know why. On April 5th, the motion detector caught her entering at 10:17 p.m., locking the door behind her. She pulled out her burner phone, sat at the desk, and dialed. The camera didn't record audio, but I watched as she smiled, laughed, and twirled a pin between her fingers. She looked comfortable, relaxed, happy, a different woman than the one I shared a bed with. She ended the call at 10:32 p.m., tucked the phone away, and left as if nothing had happened. Emily wasn't sloppy, but she wasn't perfect either. She had an alternate email address, one I had never seen before, buried in the autofill settings of our shared laptop. The domain was custom, not linked to any major provider. It was linked to the Van Aster Club. I bypassed the password with software I had used a dozen times for clients. Within seconds, I was inside. There were dozens of emails. Some were event invitations. Some were private messages with Kovacs. And some were detailed itineraries for nights I had thought she was at work or with friends. One thread, dated 3 months ago, caught my attention. From Daniel Kovacs. To Emily Mercer. Subject, Thursday night. Everything is set. I made the reservation at the Lincoln Park Place, and we'll meet at the club after. Should be a great night. I'll bring the usual. Let me know if you want me to invite anyone specific this time. Emily responded an hour later. From Emily Mercer. T.O. Daniel Kovacs. Sounds perfect. I trust your judgment. I need this. I sat back, staring at the screen. I need this. My wife had needed this. Not me. Not us. This. My stomach churned, but I didn't allow myself to react. The case wasn't finished yet. By the time April 10th arrived, I was ready. Emily had told me she was meeting her sister for dinner at a French bistro on the Gold Coast. I had already checked. Her sister was out of town. Instead of confronting her, I let her leave, waited 5 minutes, then followed. She took Lake Shore Drive, turning onto a quiet side street near Lincoln Park. Not a restaurant. Not her sister. She pulled up in front of Daniel Kovacs' condo. I parked a block away, stepped out with my camera, and found a spot near the building's entrance. At 7:42 p.m., Kovacs arrived in his silver Mercedes AMG GT. He stepped out, checked his watch, then walked inside. 5 minutes later, Emily buzzed in. I took the photos. Then, I waited. For 3 hours, I sat there, unmoving, watching couples pass by, listening to the distant sounds of Chicago nightlife. At 10:58 p.m., she finally emerged. Her hair was tousled, her blouse slightly unbuttoned. She had a look on her face that I recognized from years of watching other men's wives return home to them, carrying secrets. I raised the camera and clicked the final shot. Case closed. At 1:15 a.m., I sat at my desk, the weight of everything pressing down on me. The evidence was complete. Photos, videos, emails, GPS records. A case so airtight that even the best lawyer in Chicago wouldn't be able to spin a defense. I placed everything into a manila folder, sealing my wife's betrayal inside. I looked at it for a long time. Not as a detective, not as a husband, but as a man who had spent 10 years loving someone who had never truly been mine. I reached for my whiskey bottle, poured a drink, and watched the city lights flicker outside my window. I had all the answers now, and soon, so would she. The sun was just beginning to rise over Chicago when I made the call. I had spent the entire night at my desk, staring at the manila folder filled with everything I had uncovered. The weight of it felt heavier than it should have, as if the pages carried more than just evidence, as if they carried the last decade of my life. But I didn't have time for sentiment. This wasn't about emotion anymore. This was about execution. I scrolled through my contacts and found the number I needed. Victor Langley, divorce attorney. Langley wasn't just any lawyer. He was one of the most ruthless, efficient, and expensive family law attorneys in the state. His name was whispered in courtrooms and muttered under the breath of men who had walked away with everything while their ex-wives were left with scraps. I pressed dial. Langley's office was on the 38th floor of a high-rise on Wacker Drive, overlooking the Chicago River. When I arrived, the receptionist barely glanced up before gesturing toward a sleek glass door. Victor Langley was already waiting. He was in his early 50s, with sharp silver hair and a presence that made most men shrink. He wore a dark charcoal suit, crisp and unwrinkled, as if stress had never touched him. The kind of man who enjoyed tearing people apart for a living. I liked him already. "Mr. Mercer," he greeted me, extending a hand. "Have a seat. Let's get to work." I handed him the folder. He flipped through it in silence, his eyes scanning the contents with the precision of a surgeon. The photos, the emails, the surveillance logs, each one a knife slicing through whatever legal defense Emily might try to build. When he finally closed the folder, he leaned back and exhaled slowly. "This is airtight," he said. I nodded. "I don't want to fight. I want her out. Fast. Clean." He smirked. "You came to the right man." Langley leaned forward, tapping a pen against his desk. "We'll file under irreconcilable differences. Illinois is a no-fault state, so technically, we don't need to prove wrongdoing. But with this kind of leverage, we're going to use it where it counts." I already knew what he meant. The house. The accounts. My business. Langley nodded. "You need to start securing assets now. Legally, she's entitled to half of everything unless we play this right." I had already thought about this. I wasn't about to let Emily walk away with the life she had spent years betraying. "What's the first step?" I asked. The first thing I did was lock down our finances. We had 4 joint accounts, one for household expenses, one for savings, and 2 investment portfolios. Emily had access to all of them. If she caught wind of what was coming, she could drain them before the paperwork was filed. Langley advised me to act quickly but discreetly. I started with the primary checking account. That afternoon, I walked into our local PNC bank on Michigan Avenue, sat down with the branch manager, and moved half of the funds into a new, separate account under my name. Legally, I couldn't take it all, but I could ensure she didn't get more than she deserved. The savings account was next. I transferred the bulk of it into a trust account, one Emily had no access to. It was meant for emergencies, for our future, except the future it was protecting now was mine. By the time I was done, Emily's financial safety net was gone. Our house in Lincoln Square was worth just under $900,000. We had purchased it 5 years ago, splitting the mortgage payments equally, or so I thought. As I dug deeper into our financial records, I found something else. For the past year, Emily had been secretly transferring small amounts of money into a separate account. Langley confirmed what I suspected. "She's been setting herself up to leave you," he said, slowly moving assets, waiting until she was ready to pull the trigger. She had planned to blindside me. Now, she was the one who wouldn't see it coming. I signed over my portion of the mortgage to a third-party holding company, a legal loophole that would freeze the sale of the house during divorce proceedings. Emily wouldn't be able to sell it. She wouldn't be able to refinance it. She was stuck. My detective agency, Mercer Investigations, was something I had built from the ground up. Emily had never worked a day in it, but legally, she could argue for half. Langley had an answer for that, too. I transferred ownership of the business to a private holding company, with my brother listed as majority shareholder. On paper, Mercer Investigations no longer belonged to me. By the time Emily realized what had happened, she'd be negotiating for nothing. There was one last joint account, a vacation fund we had set up years ago. It wasn't much, about $12,000, meant for a trip we had talked about taking to Italy someday. I withdrew exactly half. The remaining balance? I left it untouched. It was a message. She would see it, and she would know that I had taken only what I was legally entitled to. But everything else? That was gone. By the time I left Langley's office that evening, the plan was fully in motion. The divorce papers were drafted, the financial protections in place. Emily had no idea that in 48 hours, her world would change completely. Langley smirked as I shook his hand. "She thinks she's in control," he said. "She won't be for much longer." I nodded. Emily had made her choices. Now, I was making mine. The morning of April 17th arrived like any other. The city was stretching awake beneath a sky smeared in early spring gray, and the hum of traffic on Lakeshore Drive filled the air. Emily was in the kitchen, standing by the espresso machine, scrolling through her phone with one hand while the other lazily stirred oat milk into her coffee. She looked so normal, so completely unbothered. If she had any suspicion that her carefully built second life had been exposed, she didn't show it. "You're up early," she murmured, not looking up. I took a sip of my own coffee and nodded. "Busy day at the office." That was a lie. There was no office today. No clients, no stakeouts, no background checks on unfaithful spouses. The only case left to close was my own. Emily glanced at the clock on the wall. "I have to run. I promised to grab lunch with Claire before heading to the office." Another lie. Claire, her so-called best friend, had been in Miami for a conference since Monday. I could have called her out, could have watched her scramble for an excuse. But that wasn't the plan. Not yet. Instead, I smiled. "Sounds nice. Oh, before I forget, I made dinner reservations for Saturday. Your birthday, remember?" Her eyes flickered up from her phone. "You did?" I nodded, setting my mug down on the counter. "Yeah. Figured it'd be nice to do something with family. Just a small gathering. Your parents, my parents, a couple of close friends. Nothing too big." She hesitated. For a split second, something flashed in her eyes. Concern? Annoyance? Guilt? Then she smiled, stepping closer to press a kiss against my cheek. "That's sweet. You didn't have to do that. You didn't deserve that," I thought. But I simply kissed her back. "Of course I did. It's your birthday." The next 2 days were excruciating. I had spent years perfecting the art of deception, but I had never imagined I would have to perform normalcy for this long. I went about my routine like nothing had changed, kissed her goodbye in the mornings, answered her texts, ate dinner with her while she talked about work. Meanwhile, I finalized every detail of the dinner. The restaurant, Marcelli's, an upscale Italian place in River North. Private dining room, high ceilings, candlelit ambience, a perfect setting for the evening's celebration. The guest list: Emily's parents, my younger sister Lisa, a handful of friends, all of them oblivious to what was coming. The time: 7 p.m. sharp. The presentation: a carefully curated selection of photographs, emails, and video stills, all waiting to be revealed. On the morning of April 19th, Emily's birthday, she walked into the kitchen wearing a silk robe, stretching her arms above her head. She looked at me with a playful smirk. "Good morning, husband." The way she said it almost made me laugh. "Morning, birthday girl," I replied, sliding a cup of coffee toward her. She took a sip, sighing in contentment. "So, dinner tonight. Do I get a hint about where we're going?" "You'll see." Another lie. She grinned. "You're being mysterious." "I like it." I looked at her over the rim of my coffee cup. "I know." Marcelli's was already bustling by the time we arrived. The private dining room was set, the long table arranged with elegant white linens, glasses of wine already poured. Emily's parents were the first to greet her, her mother pulling her into a tight hug, while her father clapped me on the shoulder. "Good man, John. She deserves a night like this." I smiled. She deserves a lot of things. One by one, the guests filtered in. My parents. My sister Lisa, who gave me a knowing glance. She could always sense when something was off, but she didn't press. The hum of conversation and the clinking of wine glasses filled the private dining room. The scent of rosemary, garlic, and simmering marinara hung in the air as waiters moved seamlessly between the tables, refilling drinks and clearing plates. Emily was glowing. She sat at the head of the table, wearing an elegant emerald green dress, her dark hair cascading over her shoulders in loose waves. The candlelight softened her features, making her look every bit the devoted wife, the accomplished professional, the woman everyone admired. It was all an illusion. Across from her, her parents chatted with mine, laughing over a shared story about a disastrous family vacation years ago. My father, ever the reserved man, actually seemed relaxed, while Emily's mother leaned in, swirling her wine glass as she spoke. To the left, my sister Lisa was scrolling through her phone, half listening, half bored, her instincts telling her something was off. Lisa had always been sharp. She had felt the tension in my voice when I invited her. She just didn't know why yet. And to my right, Emily's closest friends, Claire and Sophia, were deep in conversation, oblivious to the weight in the air. Claire had just returned from Miami and was clueless that Emily had used her name as an alibi more times than I could count. Then there was Emily's father, Richard, a man who had spent decades climbing the corporate ladder, respected in every room he entered. He was a man of principles, at least, that's what he believed. By the end of the night, his daughter would shatter that belief. Emily reached for my hand under the table, giving it a gentle squeeze. "I can't believe you did all this for me," she murmured, her eyes soft. I smiled. "You deserve it." It wasn't a lie. She did deserve this, just not in the way she thought. At 7:45 p.m., just as dessert was being served, I cleared my throat and stood. If I can have everyone's attention for just a moment. The conversation hushed. Eyes turned toward me. Emily leaned back in her chair, smiling, expecting some heartfelt speech about our life together. I reached into my pocket and clicked the remote in my hand. Behind me, a large projector screen descended from the wall. The first image appeared. A picture of Emily and me in New Orleans last year. The room collectively awed. Emily let out a small, delighted laugh. The second image appeared, a picture from our wedding day. More smiles. More nostalgia. The third image appeared, and the world stopped. On the screen, Emily stepped out of her Audi, dressed in a sleek black dress, entering the lobby of the Lincoln Park condo. Her hand grazed Daniel Kovac's arm as they stepped into the elevator together. The next slide, a zoomed-in image of them inside the glass-walled elevator. Daniel's hand on the small of her back, her face tilted toward him, smiling. The murmurs started, confused, disbelieving. Emily's mother set down her wine glass, her fingers trembling slightly. Lisa straightened in her chair, her phone forgotten. Richard's expression darkened, his jaw tightening. What is this?" Emily's voice was a whisper, the color draining from her face. I didn't answer. The slideshow continued. Emily at the Van Astor Club. Emily stepping into a black town car late at night. Emily at a private gathering in a Gold Coast penthouse. And then, the final blow. A screenshot of an email exchange between Emily and Daniel. From Emily Mercer. T.O. Daniel Kovacs. "I need this. You always know how to make it worth it." The silence was deafening. Emily's mother let out a strangled gasp. Richard slammed his fist against the table. "Emily, what the hell is this?" Her mouth opened, then closed. Nothing came out. Her eyes darted around the room, looking for an escape, for some way to explain the inexplicable. But there was no escape. Not this time. Claire was the first to react, pushing her chair back sharply. Wait. Emily, what is this? Is this some kind of joke?" Emily whipped her head toward me, her voice shaking. "John, please, can we talk about this, privately?" I crossed my arms. Privately? The word tasted bitter in my mouth. You had no problem keeping your private life separate from our marriage. Why should this conversation be any different? She flinched. Lisa let out a slow breath, shaking her head. Oh my God. I knew something was off. Emily turned to her father, voice desperate. Dad, please. This isn't what it looks like. Richard stood abruptly, the chair legs scraping against the hardwood floor. His face was rigid with rage, his hands clenched into tight fists. Don't lie to me. Emily's mother was already crying, shaking her head as if trying to wake from a nightmare. Sophia, her other closest friend, sat in stunned silence, her eyes darting from Emily to the screen. You've been lying to all of us, I said, my voice even. Emily's breath hitched. John, please. I reached into my jacket and pulled out the final piece of the night. A manila envelope. I slid it across the table toward her. Happy birthday. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Her eyes skimmed the contents. And then, she shattered. Her face twisted into horror as she pulled out the divorce papers. A strangled sob ripped from her throat. No, John, please. I held up a hand. Don't beg. It doesn't suit you. Emily's father grabbed his coat. I have nothing to say to you, he spat at his daughter before turning to me. John, I am so damn sorry. Her mother followed, unable to look at Emily as she left. Lisa stood, shaking her head in disbelief. You are unbelievable. Claire and Sophia didn't move at first. Claire looked like she might vomit. Sophia finally whispered, Emily, how long? Emily couldn't answer. I stepped away from the table, reaching for my coat. I'll have the papers finalized by Monday, I told her. You'll be hearing from my lawyer. She let out a soft, broken sound, somewhere between a sob and a plea. But I didn't care. I had given her everything, and she had thrown it away. Now, she was the one left with nothing. The drive home from Marcelli's was silent. Emily sat in the passenger seat, her hands clasped in her lap so tightly that her knuckles were white. Her breath was shaky, uneven, like she was trying to hold back tears. But she didn't say a word. She hadn't spoken since the dinner, since the bomb dropped, since her entire world collapsed around her. I kept my eyes on the road, the dim glow of the Chicago skyline stretching ahead of us as we crossed the river. The weight of the night pressed down on my shoulders, but beneath it all, I felt something else. Relief. The deception was over. The truth was out. And soon, so would she. The tires crunched against the pavement as I pulled into the driveway of our house in Lincoln Square. The home we had built together. The place where I had once believed we had a future. Now, it was just a structure. Emily hesitated before stepping out, as if the air outside was heavier than the one inside the car. She glanced at me, her eyes glistening, waiting for some kind of sign. She got nothing. I walked ahead, unlocking the front door and stepping inside without waiting for her. The house was too quiet. No soft music playing in the background, no idle chatter about her day, no warm welcome. Just silence. Emily followed, shutting the door behind her, lingering near the entrance. She was still in her green dress from dinner, but now, it looked wrong on her, like a costume she no longer fit into. John. Her voice was barely above a whisper. I turned. What? She swallowed hard, wrapping her arms around herself. Can we talk? I let out a slow breath, tilting my head slightly. Now you want to talk? Her face crumpled at the coldness in my voice. Please. For the first time that night, I really looked at her. She was wrecked. Her eyes were red-rimmed. Her shoulders hunched like she had aged 10 years in a few hours. The confident, composed woman who had strutted into that restaurant was gone. I stepped forward and placed the divorce papers on the kitchen counter. There's nothing left to talk about. Emily's hands trembled as she picked up the envelope. You already had these drawn up before tonight? Of course I did. Her lips parted, but she had no response. Because she knew. She knew that while she had been planning her secret life, I had been planning her exit. Emily exhaled shakily, her voice cracking. John, I made mistakes. But please, don't throw away what we have. I almost laughed. What we have. I stepped past her, unbuttoning the cuffs of my shirt. You threw it away first. She rushed toward me, grabbing my arm. I didn't mean to. I jerked away, my patience snapping. You didn't mean to? Her breath hitched, and I could see the panic settling in. She knew she was losing control. I love you, she whispered desperately. I let out a sharp exhale, shaking my head. No, Emily. You love the life I gave you. You love the security, the home, the comfort. But me? I met her gaze, letting the words settle. You stopped loving me a long time ago. Her face twisted, tears spilling over her cheeks. That's not true. I leaned against the counter, my expression unreadable. Then tell me something, Emily. She sniffled. Anything. I folded my arms. If I hadn't found out, would you have stopped? Silence. Her lips parted, but no words came out. And that told me everything. I nodded to myself, pushing off the counter. I want you out by tomorrow night. Her head snapped up. John, wait, please. No. Her breath came in short gasps as she shook her head wildly. This is my home, too. I let out a bitter laugh. Not anymore. She looked around the kitchen like she could find something, some argument, some excuse, that would make this all go away. But there was nothing left. Her hands trembled as she wiped at her tears. Where am I supposed to go? I shrugged. Maybe Daniel Kovacs has a spare room. The way her face crumpled told me she already knew the answer to that. She was alone in this. Just like she had left me alone in our marriage long before I ever discovered the truth. The next morning, Emily's parents showed up. I wasn't surprised. Her mother, Margaret, was on the verge of tears the moment I opened the door. Her father, Richard, looked like he had aged overnight. Emily stood behind them, clutching her arms like a child caught stealing. "John," Margaret pleaded. "Please, just talk to her." I sighed, stepping aside. "Come in." Emily avoided my eyes as they entered, her shoulders drawn tight. Margaret turned to me the moment she sat down. "She made a mistake. A terrible one. But don't throw away your marriage over this." I stared at her for a long moment. Then I reached for the folder sitting on the coffee table. I opened it and slid the photographs across to them. Emily let out a strangled gasp. "John, don't." Her father picked up a photo. His expression darkened. It was a picture of his daughter laughing, stepping into another man's home. Margaret covered her mouth, her whole body trembling. Richard's hand clenched into a fist. "How long?" His voice was low, controlled. Emily didn't answer. Margaret let out a shaky breath. "John, please. Don't let this ruin everything." I shook my head. "It's already ruined." Emily let out a sob, reaching for me. "I can fix this, I swear." I stepped back. "You can't. And I don't want you to." Her father set the photos down, his jaw tightening. "We raised you better than this." Margaret turned away, crying softly into her hands. And in that moment, I realized something. Emily had betrayed me. But now, she had lost everything else too. By that evening, Emily was gone. I stood by the front window, watching as she loaded the last of her things into the back of her white Audi. She turned toward the house one last time, her expression broken. I waited for her to say something, to beg one last time, to scream, to curse, to fight. But she didn't. She just got in the car, started the engine, and drove away. And as her taillights disappeared down the street, I felt it. The weight lifted. The betrayal still burned. But the chapter was closed. And I was finally free. Share your thoughts in the comments. Was John's revenge too brutal? Or did Emily deserve everything she got? If you like this story, subscribe to the channel and give us a like. Bye-bye.